Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I want to continue the library tour, our multi-shelf of madness, as we keep packing up all these books with a look at one of my all-time favorite series, the Vintage Contemporaries. I love these books. I've been reading them for about 15 years, and I really regard them as treasure. I see these at a charity sale, at a used bookstore. They have really distinctive spines. I snag it off the shelf. I want to check out the contents because I have discovered so many amazing novelists, wonderful short story writers in these books. I think the real strength of the Vintage Contemporaries falls into two camps. One is writers who provide this very personal, very passionate, authentic slice of their life and of their communities. And many times these are communities that don't really have a lot of fiction being published about them, particularly in the final third of the 20th century in US society. The other camp is the camp of writers who have this really slanted perspective on society. And through that perspective, we then start to uncover things. But together, these are writers who are often very funny. They have a beautiful sense of irony, and there's a real zest to many of these works. So I want to focus on just the original slate of books that were published in 1984, and then we'll get more in later videos. But let's dig into these. We start out with The Chosen Place, The Timeless People by Paule Marshall. This is originally published in 1969. It edges The Bluest Eye from Toni Morrison by just a few months, as I think one of the strongest works that announced this advancement of, hey, there are more writers and more perspectives that are coming. Listen up. This is an incredible book. It's one of the longer Vintage Contemporaries. It's almost 500 pages long. And it is an incredible look at a community of Caribbeans in a small town called Bourneville that's out on like the far end of this island. And who they are, what their lives are like. It's a really fascinating, wonderful, beautiful community. And then this research team shows up from the US. It's going to be doing all this work. And as we have this collision of cultures that, of course, reflects a previous collision of culture that was horrifying in many ways for Africans, for Native Americans, Marshall's playing on all of those themes with wonderful nuance. But this is an incredible book, and it's one I highly, highly recommend. It's hard to find in this edition. But if you do, in any edition, you check it at the library, this is a work worth paying attention to. And I should note that these distinctive covers were designed by Lorraine Louie. I'll link an article in the description box that goes into sort of the creative process that was behind the initial launch of this line. But the fact that this was in the initial lineup, I think, really was a sense of this is a series that is not going to be this traditional, realistic or modernist, continuation. It's going to challenge readers and ask us more questions. So this is one to pay attention to. I absolutely love it. Up next, we have The Bushwhacked Piano by Thomas McGuane with this great cover with the car shooting off the cliff. This book's kind of hysterical. It's disturbing in a hysterical way. I infinitely prefer it to a work like The Catcher in the Rye. Here we have Nicholas Payne, who is a pain in the neck. But the opening line of this book is, "Years ago, a child in a tree with a small caliber rifle bushwhacked a piano through the open summer window of a neighbor's living room." That sense of absurdity, that sense of a Mark Twain running around here in the upper Midwest of the US is all over this book, and it's wonderful. It's a very, very funny book at times. And it's also an incredibly sad, beautiful book. But again, just gorgeous cover. Then we have the great Peter Matheson. Matheson's Far Tortuga was part of the initial lineup. This is a strange book. It's very unconventional. And Matheson was a writer who would go on and explore different unconventional narratives, sometimes fusing them together. I think he did that incredibly effectively in Shadow Country, where he had a first third that was all of these different characters talking about this one man. And then the second portion was two sons of that one man. And then the third portion was that man's own first person narrative. But here in Far Tortuga, he is definitely going for it. It's almost stream of consciousness from perspectives that aren't necessarily even human at times. There's a ship log that's running through it, and we're out in this very far remote portion of the Caribbean again. Just a beautiful cover though. And this is one that can, I think, be very difficult. Readers who are used to The Snow Leopard, or who are used to a work like Shadow Country, or even At Play in the Fields of the Lord, are going to find something much more challenging here, something that is much more ethereal at times. These little brush strokes on life really almost drops in an ocean. If you study just enough drops, will you be able to capture a sense of the ocean? That's almost what Peter Matheson seems to be doing with life in Far Tortuga. But I would encourage, again, everybody, check this out if you can. Now, I had mentioned that the Vintage Contemporaries were a lineup of absolute heavy hitters with short stories. And that included Raymond Carver. Again, we're getting a different slice of life. We've seen a black woman's perspective on the Caribbean. We've seen Matheson's perspective on the Caribbean. That's very unconventional. We've seen Thomas McGuane up in the upper Midwest. And here we have Ray Carver over here in the Pacific Northwest. So we've yet to hit the major locales that are, producing all the fiction of the 20th century in the U.S. Here, we've got wonderful stories. Cathedral, I think, is sort of the magnum opus of Carver's wonderful miniaturist minimalist stories. There's a couple of great ones in here. The title story, Cathedral, is, I think, quite famous justifiably. A Small Good Thing is one of the great ones. Vitamins, which just is incredibly timely still. It's a look at mid-level marketing before that was ever really a thing people discussed or understood. Works like The Bridal. Where I'm Calling From is extraordinary. He would later use that as the title of a sort of a collection of his best of stories. But these stories were from later on in his career. He had really developed as a writer. And so these are stories that were published in the early 1980s. And then, this beautiful cover with the peacock here. Carver's someone, I would caution though with Carver, my one caution is his stories can feel a little similar to each other. Not so much in Cathedral, because a work like Vitamins and A Small Good Thing are totally different. Vitamins has, as I said, a woman who's sort of in a mid-level marketing, and her perspective. A Small Good Thing deals with parents who have had their child be sort of injured in a hit and run, and he's dying in the hospital. But the baker from the bakery keeps calling about the birthday cake, waiting for it to be picked up. And then how do parents who are that bereaved the very next day, what is their mindset like, and how does this baker try to make any sense of redemption, try to ask for forgiveness for what has happened? And so these stories are very interesting and beautiful and divergent. But Carver's stories, if you read a whole bunch of them in a row, can feel a little bit of the same patterns, same variations. So maybe space them out. But this is certainly one to start with. Now we do, of course, the Vintage Contemporaries did manage to hit the major urban centers of the U.S. because we have works like Dancing in the Dark by Janet Hobhouse. And this book is strange. It's a book that my wife and I have both read and had a discussion around, like, that's not like our marriage at all, is it? Here we have Morgan and Gabriella Gallagher, sophisticated young New York professionals, but they're in trouble. And they go clubbing, and the cover here is just mesmerizing. But here's the first line of this one. They'd come back from dancing at 4 o'clock and were still up drinking brandy. A long, low fatigue held them in their places, and beyond that, according to Gabriella, the intense pleasure of the moment. More than happiness, it floated as peace. And this is certainly a very different book from the Bushwhacked Piano or the Chosen Place, the Timeless People, or Far Tortuga or Cathedral. It's so different from all of those, and yet the energy, this humane energy and zest that exists at the heart of this book, particularly as we look at a couple that seem to be in a marriage that's falling apart, it's fascinating to see, and it sits, right alongside these others. Dancing Bear by James Crumley, my favorite volume of Crumley's, and a book that I regard as sort of the pinnacle of Mountain West noir. Here we're in Montana, this rural, town Montana, like towns, mining towns, old mining towns. And we have Milo Dragovich. And this is one that is dark, strange. Crumley has a very, very specific perspective he wants to share. It's very clear that many of the characters in these books, including the title character Milo, are alcoholics. It's a private eye novel that's also trying to evoke the spectacular beauty of the Western, but it's also a book that doesn't buy into this Western myth. Characters throughout are questioning. They're questioning the industrialization and deforestation of these areas. They're questioning how Native Americans have been treated. And so all of those ideas are brimming in a private detective novel. And so if you don't think, I don't like detectives, this is one, again, you might enjoy, it might intrigue you. And it is, however, the second Milo Dragovich novel. It's interesting. They went with the second one, which is the stronger one. The Wrong Case is the first of his books. And then finally, the book that was sort of published as a debut with the Vintage Contemporaries lineup in '84. These others, some of them had been published just the year before. But this one came out, was born with this series, and it's the famous Bright Lights, Big City by J. McInerney. We have the Odeon character who's looking at it, and of course the two towers of the World Trade Center that were destroyed in 2001. And so this sort of cover was iconic at the time and remains iconic for a couple of reasons now. But the book itself is wild. It is just unlike anything else I'd ever read. It was the first vintage contemporary I ever read. And when I got to the very first sentence, "You are not the kind of guy who would be at a place like this at this time of the morning, but here you are, and you cannot say that the terrain is entirely unfamiliar, although the details are fuzzy." Well, yeah, and we're about to find out why the details are fuzzy. But that second person narrative is just this strange little perspective. It's a twist on what feels like a very normal type of story, particularly from the 1980s in New York City. And yet that twist gives it this whole different meaning, this whole different life. It brings us in, it makes us, the narrator, at times to feel almost complicit with the choices that this character makes. This is a quick read, but it can be a dark read at many times, but it can also be a very, very funny read. There's a whole section on whether you should be spending time conversing and flirting with someone who thinks that decadence is like the most important word in the English language. It makes like a Shakespeare reference. So these are the vintage contemporaries. Again, I'm going to link an article in the description box about how Lorraine Louie really crafted these distinctive covers, and I'll be back with more of these because I love talking about them. But let me know if you've read any of these. Let me know what your favorites are, and hope everybody's doing well. Thanks.